In a canyon, excavating for a mine, through the mine of 49 miles, through Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you are lost and gone forever, that was so Clementine. And she was like a Mary, and she's number 9. Boxes with the boxes and it's worth for Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you are lost and gone forever, little story Clementine. Tonight we answer Mary, and the shoes are number 9. Sometimes dreaming like a sleeping lovely girl like Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you are lost and gone forever, gentle story Clementine. Drop she darklings to the water, every morning just at 9. With her food against the sleeper, coming through the fire brine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you are lost and gone forever, gentle story Clementine. Rub your lips above the water, everybody soft and fine. But alas, I was a seaman in the wars, my Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you are lost and gone forever, gentle story Clementine. In a church in the canyon, where the near looking twine, turtle rises and some posies, fertilized by Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you are lost and gone forever, gentle story Clementine. Then the night of 49 hours and began to Clementine, thought she ought to join his daughters and his now with Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you are lost and gone forever, gentle story Clementine. I'm so lonely, lost without her, wish I had a wishing light. Wish I might have cast about her, might have saved my Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you are lost and gone forever, gentle story Clementine. In the regions where the sound like giants on fire, then she rises from the water and I kiss my Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you are lost and gone forever, gentle story Clementine. Listen, lovers, listen, lovers, hear the warning that is tragic Clementine. Artificial respiration could save my Clementine. Oh my darling, oh my darling, oh my darling Clementine, you are lost and gone forever, gentle story Clementine.
The town of Kelso in Washington state had always possessed something of a notorious reputation. Serving as a hub for the numerous communities of miners and loggers who plied their trade in the surrounding area, its overabundance of brothels and other licensed premises would eventually earn the isolated rural settlement the unenviable nickname of Little Chicago. It was in the early hours of Saturday the 12th of July 1924 that a bedraggled band of gold prospectors stumbled into one of Kelso's numerous taverns, describing to other patrons how they had just barely survived an encounter with a race of what they referred to as mountain devils. As the morning progressed, the small crowd of onlookers which had assembled to listen to the group's story steadily grew in size, eventually attracting the attention of a pair of state park employees, J.H. Huffman and Bill Welsh. The two park rangers listened with interest as the 5 dirty and dishevelled newcomers paused between drinks to relate their fantastic and terrifying tale. They noted how both the band's leader, Marion Smith, and his son Roy were the most subdued of the bunch. Of the remainder, Gabe Lefevre and John Peterson were slightly more outgoing, but it was the one named Fred Beck who was doing most of the talking. Beck explained at length, pausing for occasional clarification and support from his colleagues, how the group had spent the last couple of weeks scouring the local foothills for potential seams of gold. Operating from a cabin they had recently thrown up a short distance from the Lewis River, the men had initially been quite productive, until they had suddenly been overcome by an overpowering feeling that they were being surveilled by an unseen force. As the treasure hunters had gone about their business, they had begun to notice signs that they were not alone. Mysterious tracks were found on the muddy ground near the cabin, some of which were up to 14 inches in length and possessed 4 stubby toes. The men also began to catch glimpses of a large animal moving in the depths of the forest, which they estimated to be near 7 feet tall and walking in an oddly bipedal and humanoid manner. On the afternoon of Friday the 11th, the prospectors had eaten a late lunch, before heading up into the hills to pan for gold until the onset of darkness. They had only travelled a short distance, however, before their journey had taken a completely unanticipated and bewildering turn. As they had been moving along the base of the mountain, they came face to face with a group of grotesque entities who had suddenly emerged from the shelter of a ravine which lay directly across their path. There were 4 of the creatures in total, which Fred Beck would describe as resembling huge gorillas, covered from head to toe in thick matted black fur, and estimating that they must have weighed around 400 pounds each. Time seemed to stand still as the two groups paused to regard one another. An eerie and smothering silence descended upon the scene, neither side moving a muscle, before one of the giants suddenly took a heavy stride forwards and bellowed a guttural and inhuman roar in the direction of the 5 men. Beck related how his companions had fallen backwards over themselves in sheer terror, and with the monster's savage cry echoing and reverberating off the rocky outcrop surrounding them, he had instinctively raised his rifle and fired shot after shot at the attacker. Eventually, the 4th successful hit that he scored knocked the advancing beast off its feet and sent it tumbling sideways down into the ravine it had emerged from. At this, the remaining trio of creatures also began to roar and scream, and the 5 prospectors fled the scene, only pausing some distance later when the inhuman howling and bellowing finally ceased. But the exhausted adventurers barely had time to catch their breath before they were again running for their lives, as numerous shadowy figures began to slowly emerge from the caves and fissures they had already passed. Having finally returned to the safety of their staging post, the men desperately set about reinforcing the cabin's door and windows, while simultaneously arming themselves with whatever tools or implements they could find. Mere moments after the last piece of wood had been nailed into place, the whole structure was suddenly shaken and rattled by a series of forceful external impacts. The heavy blows which repeatedly rained down from outside were accompanied by the now familiar howls of the creatures they had run from, now seeming to emanate from all around the building. It was not long before the first makeshift barricade buckled under this relentless assault, with one of the creatures attempting to haul itself inside through a gap it had created. In desperation, Roy Smith attempted to fend off the intruder with an axe, but found himself violently swatted to one side. Eventually, it was driven off with a pistol used by Roy's father, and the breach was successfully resecured. The group's attackers then seemed to change tact, and all the men could do was watch helplessly as a wide hole was smashed into the ceiling above them, before large rocks and boulders were being hurled into the cabin's interior. One of these projectiles struck Fred Beck on the back of his head, rendering him unconscious for a 2-hour period. When he awoke, the assault was still going on, his companions crouching silently beside him, firing gunshots up through the hole in the roof whenever they detected movement. Finally, at the break of dawn, the incessant roaring and hammering coming from outside the building subsided. After what they considered to have been a suitable period of inactivity, the miners peeked outside to confirm that none of the mountain devils were lying in wait, before grabbing their personal possessions and running as fast as they could in the direction of Kelso. When their story had been told, it took little more than the offer of a few drinks for Huffman and Welsh to persuade Beck to lead them back up the mountain to where he claimed the incident had taken place. After several hours clambering over the ravine in question, the two rangers could find no trace of the monsters he had described, save for a few spent shell casings. But when Beck subsequently showed them what remained of the cabin, it was a very different story. The roof of the small shack was completely smashed in, the furniture inside was shattered and broken, and the room was littered with sizable rocks and boulders. The two men paused to take impressions and measurements of numerous mysterious footprints which surrounded the wrecked structure, before they all hurried back down the mountain the way they had come, with the sun slowly starting to descend behind them. The story was quickly picked up by both local and national media outlets, which dubbed the incident the Battle of Ape Canyon, and visitors from far and wide were soon flocking to the area, in the hopes of having an encounter of their own with the elusive mountain devils. There would be no further sightings of the creatures described by Fred Beck and his colleagues, but the tale they had told would remain firmly lodged in the public consciousness for many years to come. Although Bigfoot sightings have historically occurred all over North America, the Pacific Northwest appears to be a focal point for the phenomena, accounting for well over a third of these alleged encounters. And whilst most descriptions of these enormous cryptids are remarkably similar, opinions on where they came from are more varied. Nearly every indigenous tribe in the region tells stories of cannibalistic wild men who elected to dwell away from the rest of humanity, high up in the peaks of the mountains. The natives believe that over time, these people somehow evolved into the animal-like entities their ancestors would occasionally encounter, now more monstrous in appearance than human. The existence of claw marks in some of the footprints associated with Sasquatch encounters leads some scientists to suggest that these creatures are more likely a surviving hominid previously thought extinct. There are similarities in the samples recovered from fossils found in the deserts of Africa, and it is theorized that the species may have crossed the land bridge as Pangaea separated, stubbornly enduring in more remote parts of the new North American continent.